My name's Hugh Price. I'm the Academic Director of the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence. And I have just 3 functions here today. One is to welcome you all. The second is to point out to you where the fire exits are. You see they're here and over there. And in the event of a fire, please leave rapidly through the exits and assemble, go that way and assemble in the courtyard so that we can count you all and make sure that nobody's missing. Okay, so now to the most important of my 3 functions here, and that's to introduce tonight's speaker. It's a huge pleasure for me. This lecture is the closing event of a workshop on cross-cultural trust for beneficial AI, which has been organized by the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence in conjunction with Jesus College and the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk and the new China-UK research initiative in AI ethics. And we've had several distinguished speakers with us for the past couple of days from China, as well as people from Cambridge and elsewhere. It's been a wonderful meeting. But the highlight of the meeting is tonight's lecture, and I'm delighted to introduce Professor Onora O'Neill, who I'm sure needs no introduction. Among the many distinguished positions she's held, she was principal for a long time at Newnham College. She was president of the British Academy and chair of the Nuffield Foundation. Onora is one of the world's most distinguished writers on the theme of trust. And tonight she's going to be speaking to us on cross-cultural trust for beneficial AI. Welcome, Onora.
Thank you, Hugh. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here, and the more I have listened to the various sessions, the more I'm aware of the diversity of issues and themes that are to be discussed and that fall under this broad umbrella. And my slight fear is that I may be giving you a more pessimistic account of some of the difficulties we face with finding a way in which ethical standards can be secured, maintained, improved indeed in the use of AI than you would like to hear. But I don't think that's a bad idea, because you can correct me afterwards if I get it wrong, and if I don't say it, I won't create the stimulus for that discussion, which seems to me important. So I'm going to start with a few comments on trust and trustworthiness, because after all, the theme of the workshop is cross-cultural trust for beneficial AI. You may say, and I may say, what an optimistic title. I think it is optimistic, but no bad thing. But I'm going to say why I think a focus on trust leads us to concentrate on the wrong things. And that's a completely generic point. I would make it if we weren't discussing AI at all, because I think that what we need to consider is not trust, but trustworthiness. So I hope that that will enable us to have a starting point for considering some of the specific issues that arise from the use of and the reliance on digital technologies. It is not obvious how placing and creating trust intelligently is to be secured in many contexts, and it's particularly not obvious in the case of the use of digital technologies. So let me turn first to trust and trustworthiness. Then I will come to some remarks, initially more historical remarks about the pressure that technological innovation places on standards for communication. Then I'll come on to some more episodic comments on the use of digital technologies. As everybody knows, that phrase, a crisis of trust, has become a cliche of our times. The crisis is often said to be that there is now a decline in trust, a loss of trust, and that trust was a wonderful thing because human relations that were based on trust were pleasanter, faster, not to mention much cheaper. This view of the past, I think, is tinged with nostalgia. Traditional ways of organizing things included plenty of problems. There was plenty of untrustworthiness. There was plenty of mistrust. But I'm not going to go into those themes about the empirical accuracy, about claims about past and present levels of trust, because as I see it, trust is not the fundamental issue. Let me explain why. What surely matters to most of us in our ordinary lives isn't trust, but trustworthiness. A focus on trust and levels of trust is, of course, fascinating, and empirical studies of levels of trust and their changes are ubiquitous. They provide a useful tally about generic attitudes and changes in generic attitudes across time. That is how and why the polling and advertising industries like to focus on trust. For example, opinion polls offer a guide to the level of trust in some institution or profession or commodity, and these levels of trust can be ranked. Sometimes levels of trust rise, sometimes they fall. This is what a lot of the empirical studies are interested in. Broadly speaking, this is a very broad claim, rankings of levels of public trust in various professions and institutions often remain, not always, but often remain relatively constant across time. But the actual levels of trust expressed by a given population in a particular profession or institution may vary across time. To give you a very concrete example, in the UK, politicians and journalists were ranked very low on the trust scales 20 years ago, and they still are. And nurses and judges were ranked very high 20 years ago, and they still are. That's broadly speaking. But, of course, it doesn't make headlines unless, of course, you are a newspaper that jumps on some decline and says it's significant, and we get a lot of that. But I don't think rankings are the most important issue, in particular because they do not show anything about who is trustworthy and who is not. They focus solely on the response, on composite indicators of trust or mistrust, and they ignore questions about the more basic issue of trustworthiness or lack of trustworthiness, untrustworthiness, to which these generic attitudes are a response. And I think that what matters to most of us in most contexts is the intelligent and accurate placing and refusal of trust, rather than having a high trust score regardless of the evidence. That's why I've been critical, by the way, of Facebook's use of a reputational metric that assigns users a reputation score, which merely rates not their trustworthiness, but their trustworthiness as seen by other Facebook users. As we know, reputations can be undeserved, and this metric is only looking at perceptions of trustworthiness, not at any evidence for them or evidence for their accuracy. So I conclude that a focus on trust isn't enough, and in many cases trust is not earned, placing it is risky, and it would be simply foolish to say, oh, well, we must aim for more trust, or, as is very often said, we must have more trust. What we need is to think about well-placed trust and well-placed mistrust. And where someone or some institution is untrustworthy, well-placed mistrust is a very good idea. You will all remember the story of Mr. Bernie Madoff, now in prison, who ran a Ponzi scheme in which a lot of people invested. They trusted him with their money. How much better if they had not done so. What they needed to do was to judge his trustworthiness, not just to place their trust. So our focus, I think, should not be on attitudes, but on evidence of others' trustworthiness or lack of trustworthiness in specific matters. And we're often very good at this in familiar situations, but then we find it rather hard to judge the trustworthiness of others or of institutions when we lack the necessary evidence or experience or time, and that's all too common. So let me talk about judging trustworthiness for a moment, which I think is the real issue that faces us. Judging trustworthiness well is hard because we need to take a view of what is often very complex evidence that bears on the honesty, the competence, and the reliabilities that others bring to what they do and what they say. judgments of others' trustworthiness would be unreliable without relevant evidence and the discerning use of that evidence. That's why these judgments are hard. We want, for example, to work out, do others make honest claims, and do they make commitments they will honour? Do they mean what they say? Will they do what they undertake to do? Those are very basic questions in life. Are they competent to do what they've undertaken to do? And are their honesty and their competence reliable rather than erratic? I separate out reliability when I say it's just an aspect of honesty and competence, but I think it also matters to us to have some judgment about how steadfast and reliable the other person is. These judgments need evidence. It's not enough to say, ooh, I have a generic attitude, I trust him. We require evidence about both epistemic and ethical standards and how likely they are to be met. And this can be demanding, as we all know. Honesty, competence, and reliability can't be evidenced merely by individual assertions or choices or consensus or whatever it may be. There was plenty of consensus about Mr. Madoff. Lots of people trusted him with their money. It just wasn't good evidence. Now, this casts doubt, I think, on the idea that codes that appeal to my values or our values or values on which there's a consensus are useful for judging the things that matter. We've had a lot of discussion across the 2 days of this conference about codes, and well, there are lots to be said about codes, but I'm not sure that codes or consensus will give us what we want when we're trying to place and refuse trust reliably. We need evidence for that. And of course, we all know that many measures have been taken since the beginning of the digital revolution to try to increase the amount of reliable evidence. We live in a world that has tried to impose and enforce measures of accountability, to increase transparency, and has used a great variety of legal, regulatory, and some more informal measures. These approaches have, of course, been used for generations. Audit is nothing new, financial audit, but they have been greatly intensified in the last few decades. But while the accountability revolution of recent decades has often been intense, I think we are aware that it has not always been effective. Its achievements have been augmented, but unfortunately also complicated by increasing reliance on digital technologies. And I'm going to comment on the effects of these two transformations in turn. I think they're distinct, although now quite deeply interconnected. So the accountability revolution of the last 40 years has developed the very long-standing use of law and regulation to support compliance with required standards and thereby increase trustworthy performance. That's what accountability is for. It's sometimes seen as a matter of imposing measures that secure better compliance and better regulation and aim to support a variety of standards that regulation should meet, such as, the list will be familiar to many of you, proportionality, accountability, consistency, transparency, and targeting. These standards matter, but they're often not very popular. They're not much liked because meeting them can be intrusive, time-consuming, and irritating. Moreover, they're sometimes badly designed and even unfit for purpose. Jesse Norman MP, who wrote a marvellous book on Burke and perhaps a slightly less marvellous one on Adam Smith, remarks in a piece in the current issue of History Today, I quote, "The end of history is not the triumph of democratic capitalism, but the triumph of bureaucracy." We've all felt that, and it's not a triumph that all of us like. Moreover, some of the aims of accountability requirements may simply be misplaced. I think in particular that the emphasis on transparency rather than communication is often unfortunate. It is often communication rather than transparency that matters when we aim to judge others' trustworthiness, not trustworthiness or untrustworthiness in specific matters. The fact that we can shovel information into the public domain is not a form of communication. It's just something easy and something that digital technologies make particularly easy. So I think we have to note that one of the oddities of the last decades has been a tremendous emphasis on standards that are extremely simple if you've got digital technologies, among them transparency or openness, which are typically implemented in ways that are quite negligent about the capacities of individuals to find, understand, or make use of the relevant information. Every time you read somebody saying or hear someone saying, oh, we should be more transparent, I think that's the moment to get suspicious. What will it do? What is it for? Whom is it for? Is it because it's cheap and easy but doesn't really secure very much? So, although I understand why that emphasis on transparency was a feature of the early decades of the digital revolution, I think it was hyped in a way that has not been sustainable and that its promise has not been fulfilled. Now, digital technologies, as we know, are often spoken of as communication technologies. I think this is quite misleading. It is indeed one of their uses, but the technologies can also be used to influence, to persuade, to secure others' attention, to mislead, to manipulate, to deceive, to defraud, and as we now realize, to corrupt democratic processes and to undermine serious journalism. So we shouldn't automatically think that, oh, it's communication, it's lovely stuff, it's everybody communicating with everybody. As people, I think, tended to think, I don't know whether to say 10 or 20 years ago, that was a sort of Habermasian legacy. And I think Sir Tim Berners-Lee, the father of the World Wide Web, summed matters up rather nicely last September in these words, quote, I have always believed the web's for everyone. That's why I and others fight fiercely to protect it. The changes we've managed to bring have created a better and more connected world. But for all the good we've achieved, the web has evolved into an engine of inequity and division, swayed by powerful forces that use it for their own agendas. And I think that that little speech, September 2018, signals, as it were, a gathering change of outlook on these technologies that has emerged in the last year. Digital technologies, we now realize, are not merely communication technologies, and their widespread use and their widespread misuse has had both wonderful and very damaging effects. So we don't find ourselves today in an age of trustworthy communication, but in one of communication that is sometimes trustworthy, but that's difficult to judge, but is sometimes distorted and suppressed, diverted and skewed, controlled and managed in multiple ways that are often hard to detect or prevent. And that, in a way, is a lot of what this conference has been about. It's often difficult to trace the sources of corruption of communication because, and I'll try to come back to this a bit, anonymity is very routine in online contexts despite all the lip service paid to transparency. The oxymoronic term fake news now has all too apt a use. And it's not new. So let me now turn a little bit to the history of technological innovation in areas that involve communication. The implication of technological innovations for speech and communication have been discussed since antiquity. Plato told us that Socrates thought that writing, which was then a newish communication technology, which many people couldn't decipher, they couldn't read, was a deceptive and effective way of communicating, and so he relied entirely on the spoken word. Socrates relied on the spoken word. That's what Plato wrote. Plato, of course, had to write, or we wouldn't know about this. what he wrote about Socrates' views, and Socrates didn't do any writing. But I think that the words that Plato reports of Socrates are often true of the online world. Let me quote them to you. This is from Phaedrus, 274.5, if you want to look it up. When it has once been written down, every discourse roams about everywhere, reaching indiscriminately those with understanding, no less than those who have no business with it, and it doesn't know to whom it should speak and to whom it should not. And when it is faulted and attacked unfairly, it always needs its father's, that is, its author's, support. Alone it can neither defend itself nor come to its own support. Socrates' complaint, in short, was that written words can be separated from their authors. Speech content, as we say in my trade, can be separated from speech acts, and readers often lack the information that would be conveyed by tone, gesture, and context in face-to-face communication. Imagine yourself, you're walking along some road in ancient Greece, or it could be ancient China, and you see an inscription carved in some stone, and you think, what's that? What does it mean? Who put it there? Who owns it? Is it a spell? Is it a curse? Don't like it. And I think that's very understandable as an initial response to writing. Communication may fail if we can't ask questions and clarify, and often people could not follow or assess the written word. The separation of reader from writer weakens, and it can undermine abilities to interpret, to explicate, to defend, to vouch for the meaning, the truth, or the trustworthiness of written words. Readers often need some grasp of sources, of evidence, of transmission, of context, of culture, in order to judge whether written material, inscriptions, are true or false, plausible or far-fetched, evidence-based or imagined, hostile or helpful, and much more. Now, bit by bit, as we all know, Socrates' worries about the written word have been answered, but it was very slow. But now, writing is seen as a particularly reliable way of communicating, and I think for two reasons. On the one hand, it can be used to provide lasting records, and secondly, it allows claims to be cross-checked. But additional questions about texts and their reliability arose with the next technological innovation, which was, of course, not writing, but printing. In the West, printing, of course, was there in China first, the introduction of printing could be traced to the early modern period, and it enabled the production of multiple copies of texts, authorized or unauthorized, whose origins, authority, and indeed legality might be obscure or deceptive. Gradually, and it took a long time, across the following 2 centuries, ways of ascertaining authorship and of checking the truth and trustworthiness of printed claims were improved by a range of cultural, legal, and regulatory measures, including, of course, the invention of copyright and requirements for imprints in printed texts. Today, digitized content, however, circulates with very incomplete systems for checking or challenging its trustworthiness. We don't have anything like that which copyright produced. I have to say it took a remarkably long time. So the Statute of Anne, which I think is 1710, is the first legal instrument requiring copyright. 1710, when Charles Dickens did a lecture tour in the United States 140 years later, American printers were blithely plagiarizing his works, printing them and selling them. And I suppose it took the Berne Convention and quite a lot more to get international recognition of copyright, which has not been achieved even for the printed word, even in our own times. I remember once being in Baku in the Caucasus, and I was at the time a syndic of the university press here, and our best-selling book was for sale in the market. So I whizzed over to the stall to look at it. And there it was on sale for $1. And we were selling it for 25 quid. And I thought, how is this possible? Well, I picked up a copy and I looked in it, and it had all the Cambridge University Press imprint and the details, address of Cambridge University Press. But there was a little stamp in there which said, produced by the University of Tehran. So that is where it had been pirated and presumably then shipped across the Caspian, and it was nice and cheap. So bit by bit, Socrates' worries about the written word were answered, and writing is now seen as reliable because of those lasting records and cross-checking. But these additional checks that printing enabled and that then copyright enabled may still be insufficient for the digital world. Are there remedies? And I think that is a large part of what we are considering in this particular conference. Is there anything that can be done with the use of digital technologies for various purposes that would be the equivalent of the sort of disciplines that printing was subjected to in the last couple of 100 years or 300 years? I think realization of the varied, sometimes very risky effects of digital technologies has been spreading remarkably fast, but equally very erratically in the last year. I thought it was an extraordinary change subsequent to Berners-Lee's comments when we saw the tech companies, at least ostensibly say, that's the Western tech companies, say, oh, we need regulation. And we urgently need to address the problems. But I think this is going to prove hard. So my aim now is to try to start us on a discussion, and I'm going to begin with a scattering of thoughts. First of all, and I'm sorry to say this because I know that many people think this is a very good idea, I think the production of nice-sounding codes by institutions is probably breath wasted. I said this at Wednesday at the meeting we had at the Nuffield Foundation in London. And of course, it's very easy to produce a nice sounding code. There are an awful lot of codes. The G7 have a code. The Church of England has a code. Yesterday in the House of Lords, one of the bishops introduced a debate on the Church of England's code for these matters. So I think various measures have been taken, but they may not be durable, and I would say codes may indicate a momentary consensus, but they are not robust, and they have no deep standing just because they are codes. To have deeper standing, we'd have to have some arguments. There are, of course, measures that have already been undertaken. I don't know how durable they will prove. In the European Union, a subject of widespread praise and self-congratulation, we have the General Regulation on Data Protection. Note that the General Regulation is only a set of measures designed to deal with breaches of privacy. But like its predecessor, the Data Protection Directive, it doesn't even aim to address the many, many other ethical issues raised by uses of digital technologies. So I think we have there an indication that because we're talking about domains in which a plurality of standards are likely to be relevant, the idea that we can pursue one of these standards with great precision by itself may not be the best idea. But I'm not against the General Regulation on Data Protection. However, I think it is probably conceptually deficient because it is based on a definition of so-called personal data, so for example your name, your address, your password, and so on. But unfortunately there is no legally adequate definition of personal data. To be sure, we count the name and address as personal data, but individuals are often identified by inference using non-personal data rather than by the wrongful, careless or illegal disclosure of personal data, although all that happens. And I think that developments in AI are likely to extend the number of inferential methods that can be used to identify individuals using data which is in any case in the public domain. And I read a number of articles, I think 4 or 5 years ago, which provided proof of principle on this, not by identifying every individual with some characteristic, but by identifying, on the whole, it was about 15 or 20% of them using only public domain data sets. So I'm skeptical about the shelf life of the general regulation on data protection. We shall see. Still, privacy is only one of the standards, and it's one of the ones where I think we may have to rethink its protection in the not too far future. And I do think that the big change of the last year has been to see the tech companies in the West rethinking their resistance to regulation, saying they need it. Now, I have heard, and no doubt many of you have heard much more, quite cynical responses to that, which suggest that their real aim is to exclude new entrants to the space. It's not about escaping regulation now, it's about ensuring that new players really can't comply with the complexity of regulation to provide a deterrent to their development. When I looked at a diagram recently of the number of startups in the tech space that had been taken over by the big tech companies, I wondered whether this was plausible or necessary. Some of you will know the answer. However, to move on to the issues that have to be confronted, I think there's a useful distinction to be drawn between measures to prevent private harms to individuals, a lot of them about, a big matter of public concern, cyberbullying, fraud, extreme porn, and so on and so on. And on the other hand, measures to prevent or mitigate public harms to democracy, science and culture. Now, it's not that individuals are not harmed by these public harms, it is that the incidence of the harming cannot be traced to particular sources or individuals. I think the tech companies will prove to have a genuine interest in eliminating private harms, which on the whole damage their commercial reputations. But it won't be easy for them either, and I read, and many of you read with much more understanding, accounts of their success on identifying online harms, as the phrase now goes, and succeeding in identifying and taking down. It doesn't look to me as though the success rate is what one would wish. I think, however, and this is what interests me more, that it's much less clear that the companies have an interest in regulation that prevents or mitigates public harms to democratic process, to serious journalism, or to culture, to public culture. And as you know, there's now a very large literature on these topics. A large number of existing regulators in this country of specific sorts of communication are moreover currently not fit for purpose. For example, we have the Electoral Commissioner who regulates the advertising in elections. We have Ofcom that regulates broadcasting. We have the Information Commissioner that tries to regulate data privacy, and a lot more, Advertising Standards Authority. But it seems to me that at present, for very good reasons, we have drafted the legislation to be very narrow. A conundrum that I do not know the answer to is, it's all very nice to regulate political advertisements by political parties during election campaigns and referendum campaigns, which we do in this country. But actually, that doesn't regulate advertising by individuals or organizations that are not political parties or by anyone outside the period of elections and referenda. You can see why the regulation was narrowly focused, but you can also see that it means that many people can get round it, and of course we are all aware that money speaks, and ultimately that it may be the security forces of other states that are engaged. Now, this is why I have come to the view that because regulation is very difficult, it may be important to couple regulation with effective cultures of the right sort. I don't think that's going to be at all easy. The attractions are clear enough. Contemporary institutional life, as you all know, is full of requirements that subordinate practitioners to very complex regulations, but also that insulate them from the check and challenge of those who are seen as outsiders. That's one way of looking at what is called the silo effect, suggesting that it's a very good idea. You don't want informal check and challenge to people in the institutions. However, if you thought regulation could do everything, that might make sense, but if it can't, this may prove damaging and expensive. A shared culture can provide a powerful pressure and means for coordination, which could be faster and cheaper and secure more sorts of coordination than regulation by itself can offer. And so, again, if one thinks that the route is codification, I think one needs to think very seriously about the limits of codification and the enforcement of codes. However, then we hit another difficulty. If a shared culture is to be useful, it has to be a culture of the right sort, one that promotes trustworthy speech and trustworthy action, one that penalizes untrustworthy speech and untrustworthy action. And quite a lot of cultures either foster or fail to challenge unacceptable sorts of culture and coordination. Let me be very simplistic and offer three stereotyped examples. There are some corrupt and destructive cultures that actually undermine or evade standards of honesty, competence, and reliability. They include not only bad corporate cultures, but also bad bureaucratic, political, and dare I say it, academic cultures. There are bad cultures all around us, and of course when something goes radically wrong, we hear about it. But usually what we have are, I suppose, fed up people doing their compliance in the institutions and not really achieving what is hoped for. Then there are adequate cultures that support compliance with law and regulation, but that's all they do. There are a lot of mere compliance cultures, and I think that's very understandable in an era of excessive regulatory zeal. If we feel that the bureaucrats are making absurd and excessive demands, and goodness knows one often feels that, one has to think, look at what they were asked to do and look at the tools they had. And then, of course, there are sometimes good cultures that demand not mere compliance, but clarity and engagement with a wider range of standards that matter for institutional life. And combine that with willingness to check and challenge when the standards are breached. I think there's a very long way to go. And any of you who have been part of an institution that has sought to achieve cultural change will know just what I mean. When I was part of the UK's Banking Standards Board, and remember, banking is a sector where, of necessity, there is very heavy regulation, but regulation is not enough. I saw at first hand what cultural change actually demands of institutions that are already enduring heavily regulated environments. By the way, the Irish banking sector is now, I think, following the same approach, and I expect more will, because there has been recognition that regulation alone wouldn't secure the integrity of banking and other financial institutions. I'm going to stop now because I think I've laid out a bit of a map, but there are lots of topics that we can go on to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Onora, and for the sake of people watching this on the live stream, on a recording, I'd like to assure people that this is the authentic Onora O'Neill, not a pirate copy, let alone what do they call it, a deep fake. We have the real thing here. Now, we're now going to have time for questions. We have a couple of roving microphones, so if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and I'll ensure that you get a microphone. Yes, we have somebody at the back up there. Oh, yeah, that's, and then you, sir.
Yep, there you go. Thank you. Thank you. Fascinating conference. Thank you very much. My question is about open source, non-jurisdictional, non-agent-based technologies. Those that are created or associated within the blockchain and the Bitcoin cyberspace that try to remain anonymous, untraceable, and whose products or services do not have a jurisdiction, a CEO or board members, and therefore it's difficult to create liability towards those actors. Thank you.
I think you finger one of the real problems in that people often imagine that anonymity is an excellent thing. And I can see, as we all can, that where you have a corrupt or dictatorial regime, journalists require anonymity if they're to report honestly. And we can think of many other contexts where anonymity is necessary. But where we seem to have landed in this particular area is, in my view, not so encouraging, because what we have seen is that there's plenty of breach of individual anonymity. We see companies being fined for this very regularly, but at the same time, there is anonymity for those who commission, pay for, distribute, and so on, perhaps malicious, perhaps merely tendentious or political advertisements. So I believe the time has come when we would do much better to have a serious discussion of the claims of anonymity and their limitations than to emphasize too much the claims of privacy.
Thank you. Going back to your point about transparency not amounting to communication, I wonder if I could try a note of optimism here. Because I suppose one way of putting the problem is that somebody puts a whole load of data out there, or lots of different organizations do. That's not in itself communication, because the people who have access to it then don't know what to do with it. They don't know where the interesting bits are, which questions to ask. Yeah? And if they did know which questions to ask, that would at least be a form of communication. Do you see any hope that AI systems will have a role in going through those data sets and saying, here, this is interesting, I think you should be asking about that?
That's rather encouraging, I have to say, because I think the difficulty about transparency has been that it neglects the recipient. And certainly, when the Royal Society did a report on science as an open enterprise about 5 or 6 years ago, and when we were working on that, it was quite clear that mere openness, merely putting stuff in the public domain, was not enough. And now you've suggested one of the things that might make it more powerful. At the time, we suggested that transparency or openness only began to have effects if you coupled it with ensuring that it was actually available to the audiences that mattered, that it was actually understandable to those audiences, and that they could actually assess it. Now, those are quite high standards, and this was early days, but that was the sort of thing we were gesturing to. Now, it might be that AI systems could help us a lot with sifting and sorting and so on. I think perhaps there are others here who will know more about this, but I would just say that there are AI systems and AI systems.
Julian.
Thanks. Useful to bring the microphone to myself, and thank you very much for a fascinating talk as ever. I wanted to pick up that idea about openness and communication. Because I think you suggested that transparency was a poor substitute for communication. Can I suggest they're two different things, and that communication is really helpful, but actually transparency is also helpful for trustworthiness, either because somebody can use an AI to search through, or because people might be interested in different things. If my concern is whether an organisation is doing something very specific, the fact that I can go and look helps, and may or may not be the thing that they communicate. So while I would agree that communication is essential as well, can I also suggest that you also support transparency as well?
I think that's reasonable. What I want to get us away from is thinking that transparency is the key to all this, because I think transparency is just one tool. As you say, then people they may go and look, but equally they may not go and look. All of you know the story about the person who invented an end-user license agreement within which, if you signed it, you promised to give your firstborn to the devil. Well, of course, it was a spoof, but the fact is most people signed it. And this, I think, is the problem about the very voluminous data that is put in the public domain in the name of securing transparency. Human beings have busy lives and limited enthusiasm for reading long and complex documents. And I suppose the area where I feel this has been brought into most contempt is in having people consent to certain arrangements. And goodness knows, every time you get new software, you consent to things. Do you read the agreement? I hope you don't. Life is too short. But equally, in some countries, we have pretty good commercial regulation, the legislation that will prevent unconscionable things being put in. In other places, not so. And the fantasy that real human beings are going to spend their lives reading the small print seems to me just that, a fantasy.
Jess.
Thanks, Onora. That was really interesting. You were emphasizing at the end there the importance of culture in addition to regulation, and I definitely agree. At the same time, culture is this incredibly amorphous thing, right? And I think we don't necessarily understand very well how to create good culture, or creating good culture is very difficult, and changing problematic culture is even harder. I would love to hear a bit more from you about what you think. Are there things we know about how to create good culture? How do we do that? How do we think about that?
That's a really good area to think about, and I've only begun to think about it. But it seems to me that it has led me to reread some of the older social anthropologists who I think thought about this a good deal more than many others. I always find Richard Sennett very valuable on this, but many others. So I'm trying to get a sense of what makes culture have grip. One thing one has to say is if you hyper-regulate, you may very well undermine the culture. You have to leave a space for the culture to flourish. And certainly in banking, there is no thought that securing culture change is going to be done by removing regulatory requirements. Banking has to be heavily regulated for very good reasons. But the sorts of things that we certainly discovered at the Banking Standards Board is that what matters a lot, first of all, you find out, what we actually did was dead simple. We held up a mirror to the institution, but nobody inside the institution knew who had said what. For example, we asked people about, if something was going wrong in your institution, would you whistleblow? Would you report it? And a very high proportion of people said either, no, I wouldn't, because it might not be very good for me and my career if I did, or alternatively, no, I wouldn't, because nobody would listen. Now, those are two very salient indicators which you can only get when it is an outside body discovering what the staff think. There were institutions that made considerable progress in the standards of their culture, and I would say that the thing you put your finger on as most central is the attitude of the chief executive, the top management and the board only if you walk the walk and not just talk the talk. As you know, many institutions talk about their values, and I always have a secret giggle when they talk about their values, because their values are things that one suspects a PR consultant suggested to them. So their values are things like, ooh, we believe in integrity, we believe in service, we believe in, they say this, trust. They say all of that, but they do not walk the walk. They just talk the talk. So I think that what one has to concentrate on is what does it take to enable people, and it's, by the way, much happier for staff and management alike if this is done, but it's not enough simply to say these are our values. Back to Groucho Marx, as I'm always referring to Groucho Marx this day. Groucho Marx said, yes, I have principles, and if you don't like them, I have some others. And by the way, Mrs. May quoted him yesterday, that very sentence. And that is interesting, isn't it? Because to think that my values have some weight just because they're mine. We often hear people talking about Western values, Chinese values, British values, American values. Well, so what? You know, I would look for an argument for the justification of the standards and norms that are referred to under that heading. So that's why I've forsworn the use of the word value, which seems to me to be a way of free riding on either subjectivism or, at very best, communitarianism. And I suppose that comes back to my criticism of codification.
David, and then Joe.
Sort of following up on that, so you said that accurate placement of trust requires evidence about adherence to epistemic and ethical standards. And to me, that seems to imply that mutual trust requires coming to some consensus about what normative standards are applicable. Of course, you're not optimistic about codification of principles. What do you recommend?
A consensus will not be enough or necessary. A consensus is substituting agreement for the justification of normative standards, whether epistemic or ethical. So although a consensus may be politically necessary, it's not the fundamental thing. There are many cultures and subcultures in which there's a considerable consensus on some very evil standards. And that's, I think, something one has to face at the start, that this is not going to be a sort of cheap neo-positivist ride in which we invoke the values that happen to be current and say, these are our values.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. I really appreciate your point, judging trustworthiness on the basis of evidence. In the case of human interaction with robots or with artificial intelligence system, now because the deep learning technology is really very popular in this area, but there's a kind of like black box, obscure side in this process. So for a kind of trustworthiness of robots as a counterpart in this dialogue, it seems to be kind of required that we can understand this process. So some artificial intelligence specialists in China, they explained to me, I said, how to open this black box. They said, we make it transparent, right? Making them explain themselves. And that's a way to help people to really understand and appreciate this kind of trustworthy counterpart. Now, I just come back to my question. I'm just wondering whether this evidence or the transparency could be also counted as a characteristic of evidence, which you really stress here when we have certain judgment of trustworthiness. Thank you.
Well, transparency, I think, will not be sufficient for judging trustworthiness. In a particular institutional context, it can, of course, be quite valuable. For example, you may know that this company or this individual has a certain reputation, and that will be concerned to maintain that reputation, and that will give you a piece of evidence that is very useful for coming to a view about whether they will or will not do what they say and whether they will or will not say what they mean. So, of course, it's very valuable in the right context, but I suppose one always has to hold these issues up against the reality of untrustworthy communication, untrustworthy speech, and untrustworthy action, and ask, is it adequate to deter that in this particular case? And I believe one of the reasons why we see so much confidence in these technologies in certain quarters is that they are extremely good for consumerist purposes, so that if, for example, I'm deciding, as I did not long ago, to buy a new electric kettle, so I go online, I look at the consumer rankings of the kettles, and it's very revealing. I got a 5-star kettle, and it works pretty well. Now, why is that ranking reliable in that case? And I think the answer is twofold. First of all, we're talking about a standardized commodity. This is very different from judging whether to trust this official or that official, this institution or that institution, standardized commodity. Secondly, the way the consumer rankings are done, they have a sufficiently large, and we hope, randomized set of contributors to those rankings. And where that is the case, these rankings are actually quite valuable evidence. But the world does not consist of decisions whether or not to purchase standardized commodities that have been ranked by a properly structured sample of others.
Thank you, Onora. I'm going to suggest a rather narrowing conclusion I draw, that trustworthiness is a quality only of a person whom you have known for a good while. It cannot therefore be a quality of an institution or organization because there are too many people in them. And it cannot be a quality of a piece of information unless you know quite a lot about the person putting it out. I go back to the rather good point about anonymity at the beginning. I'm a little depressed about the future for AI under that sort of system.
And you're more pessimistic than I am, which I thought very few people would be. I think that, a lot of the judgments we make are approximate judgments, so that I might make a judgment, and I go back to the sort of traditional life that you and I knew when we were young. You might judge that a particular shop in a particular village, which is not an individual, it's a family, is trustworthy. Why? Because you know it, you understand them, you know what they do, you know that they wouldn't sell you rotten eggs and all the rest of it. Or a school. So think of some of the more familiar institutions, not vast anonymous bureaucracies, but some of the more familiar institutions. And I think we do make reasonable, of course not infallible, judgments of trustworthiness. Equally, our judgments of individuals are not infallible. The reason I have frequently referred to the story about Mr. Madoff is that he was very well trusted by all the people who invested their money in his Ponzi scheme and lost it. There was a case of trusting an individual, and the evidence was misleading. But I think there are cases of trusting institutions. But what has surely happened is that many more of the institutions we deal with extend beyond our comprehension of them. In a simpler society, you could know whether the local corner shop or indeed the local primary school or your college was run in a trustworthy way. It gets harder now, and I think that one of our difficulties is trying to devise simple, let's use the word, indicators for complex institutions, and this is extremely difficult, which is really why I came out at the end speaking in favour of an amalgam of the institutional measures and metrics for trustworthiness, and on the other hand, the cultural measures that may take up some of the slack. But I don't underestimate how difficult it is going to be to extend those.
Joanna, you had a quick
question. Well, thanks again. As always, your talk is great. There was one thing you said early on, and I love the way you break things apart and see the components, but I'm going to suggest a slightly different ontology. You said about that the flow of information through the internet is not communication anymore. You know, and I'm wondering if, so in another sense of communication, what's being communicated is power rather than knowledge that an individual can grab onto. So maybe identity. I mean, this is still technically all information, but the work is being done at some kind of collective level rather than at the individual level. So I'm not sure if that helped tease anything apart, but it was the second to last question.
It does help in the following way, that of course we are aware that a lot of what is going on is to do with the control of communication and of the hiding of communication. So our difficulty, the difficulty that anonymity creates for us, is we can't tell. And I go back to that image I have of the Plato's contemporary. There is Socrates, and he says, "Write, if it's written, forget it." And someone else says, no, it's very valuable. And how are we to resolve that? Because I think our predicament is not unlike the one that Socrates was pointing to. That is to say, we don't have at our fingertips the means for judging what's going on. And I feel that I would have been one of those people wandering around. I imagine the same would be in China. You're looking at this rock face. There are these characters. Who put them there? Whose are they? What are they for? Really difficult. And I think that that's the situation we have to address, that, and where we have been simply, I think, irresponsible in imagining that ordinary people with busy lives can assess the content that is shoveled at them and inflicted on them. That wasn't a very complete answer, Joanna. I'm sorry, too many thoughts spring to mind.
It's not a question, but more of a comment in a way that I think trustworthy is not only about agency that the gentleman talked about. I think it's also about understanding. I think for the current AI, what we have is actually there's no understanding but statistics. When you talk to Siri saying, I'm really in an urgent phase, so I need to go to the bathroom. So it says just 5 meters away, there's a KFC, so that you can go there. But it does not really mean that Siri understand what do you mean by kind of emergency and what do you mean by KFC with the relationship to the restrooms is all about co-occurrence and statistics. So when you trust somebody that you really have an idea that it is with experience, it can learn from the experiences, and it can also reason. But for the current AI is actually, like I said, you have natural language processing, but you don't really have natural language understanding. So in this case, I think trustworthy AI is not only about the trustworthy part, but deeply rooted to the nature of intelligence. That for now, we're doing something that use larger scale data to do something that seems to be intelligent, to process those information instead of to really understand those information and to produce and to do reasoning based on the facts. So I see this as the foundational issue that we should deal with for the current AI to really have.
That comes, does it not, quite close to saying our problem is with AI that we can access the speech content, but we cannot tell what the speech act is. And I think that that's a very general description of the predicament that we face in so many situations, that I understand up to a point what the words mean, but I don't really know. And something I left out of this talk, but I think some of these historic examples are quite helpful. If one goes back to 18th century France, pre-revolutionary France, of course there was censorship, political censorship. So Montesquieu wanted to write a political criticism of the Ancien Régime at the time, which he did. It's Les Lettres Persanes, the Persian letters, and he sets it all in a fictitious account of ancient Persia. Very clever. So people read this fictitious account of ancient Persia, and of course they immediately know he's talking about what's going on in Paris. But he hasn't said, his words are not the problem, his speech act works. And I think if we look at the ways in which historically people have reacted to censorship, we can learn quite a lot. My understanding is, and some of you here will know this, that in China there is an extremely developed lexicon of forbidden terms that people all understand. No, I wasn't asking anyone to comment.
Joanna, the person in the second row.
Thank you very much for that stimulating talk. Can I come back to the issues you were raising at the end about the insufficiency of regulation?
Yeah.
And the importance you place on cultural change. So, I mean, the question that I have about that is, I know you're not being overly optimistic here, but I wonder whether in this particular area you're being too optimistic. Because you're dealing here with large corporations.
Can you raise your voice a little? I think it's quite hard to hear over here.
You're dealing with large corporations.
Yes.
Who have a very strong vested interest in staying exactly as they are and pursuing the paths that they are pursuing. So why could we expect them to change their cultures? Don't we, as a society and polity, have to rely on the only tools that we have, which are political power and law, to make them change their cultures? Because expecting them to do it on their own is just too optimistic.
That's a very good question, and I'm sorry I didn't get onto those topics because I do take them very seriously. I think we have a serious problem here, but the gesture you make is in the direction of heavier, more intelligent, more intrusive regulation, and it's something that is attempted again and again. Why does it not work? One reason it does not work is that in a globalized world, a great deal is offshored, or a great deal is on, and I don't understand this area, is encrypted, and it gets hard to regulate because of that. I think we are mistaken if we think we live in a world only of powerful states. The powers of many states have been diminished by globalization. So the idea of, as it were, upping the intensity of the regulatory tools is attractive, but first of all, complexity has its costs, and secondly, it's not clear that you can get agreement on it, and thirdly, offshoring is the way people evade it. That, I take it, is why people speak longingly about antitrust movements, moves to challenge over-concentrated and over-mighty commercial power, corporate power, but why in the end it's extremely difficult. a century ago in the United States, that was the measure used to deal with the overpowerful corporations of the day. Do we think it can be used with the overpowerful tech companies of today? I don't know. It's a very specialist topic, but I think it's a serious one for thinking about.
Joanne, do you have a comment on this point?
Well, I actually have a follow-up question. Do you have an opinion formed on the effort announced today by Macron in France to tax the global, the top 50 companies, not necessarily tech and not just American ones? They got it, the number threshold down low enough that one French one is in there too.
Yes, that was astute of them, given what Mr. Trump was busy saying, that it was a discriminatory measure against American companies. I don't know whether it would work. I think that is quite a detailed regulator's question. Now, if it could be made to work, why haven't we made it work yet? And we are all of us aware that some of the tech companies in Europe have headquartered themselves in the Republic of Ireland, and I'm afraid we don't tax them there as heavily as they would be taxed elsewhere, and others have headquartered themselves in Luxembourg, ditto. And this is an example, as it were, within the European Union of offshoring. People offshore to avoid regulation or tax liability, and to be crude about it, Amazon make their profits in Germany and Britain, but get taxed in Ireland, or Google's in Ireland and Amazon in Luxembourg. I mean, that is not a situation that people will tolerate for the long run. And I don't know whether France has an answer to this question. I do very much understand what question they are trying to address.
Onora, I have a question, and it goes back to this distinction between communication in speech and in writing. And as you put it, the concern about writing, or at least the concern expressed in modern terms, is that in writing you just get the content, you don't get the speech act. Now, obviously, one of the things that's characteristic of some of the new digital technologies...
other way around, I think. You get the content, but not the act.
Isn't that what I said? Well, I'm sorry. Yeah,
I get it. Yeah.
So in writing, you have the content, but you don't get the intentions.
Yeah. Yes.
Because you haven't listened to the author of the text. Because one of the things that the digital technology gives us, I mean, this has been true for a century with broadcasting, but broadcasting is all very centralized, so you have a sense of where it's coming from. But with new technologies, which are giving us audio and video, a lot of what we're getting and a lot of what's creating the problem is not text, it's speech. But that hasn't kind of fixed the problem by putting the speech act back in, as it were, because a lot of the inauthenticity is in the speech acts that are presented. So they pretend to be one thing, but actually there's another intention in the background.
That's very well put, Hugh. I think that if one goes back to the 1930s and the regulators are beginning to grapple with broadcasting, the FCC is set up in the United States, BBC's in the 1920s here, and regulating broadcasting was a very difficult thing. One might think, but why was that? Because, hey-ho, it was speech. But think just about sound broadcasting. It's disembodied speech. Who speaks? And so on. And the current situation is that we can have highly realistic-looking film footage, possibly even faces we can identify, but that is inauthentic. And I think that that can undermine our most basic capacities to say, oh yes, that was so-and-so, he would go on about that because he is allied with so-and-so, and he is a political player with this agenda. I understand it, I judge it. Our judgment is distorted by the possibility of the evidence being, let us say, reconfigured. And I do not know how we are to deal with this. I realize that facial recognition technology will make this much, much easier, and there you will have people whom you really like and really trust telling you to do things that you never thought you would even consider doing. But it won't be them.
Yes. Yes. Okay, now I think there's a question here at the back. And is there anybody that I've missed who would like to ask a question?
Thank you again. My question is about agency and fatality. As globalization grows and the power of the nation states decreases, there's also a larger access knowledge for organizations to build this AI and digital identities. My question is, how much agency does an individual has, or a small startup, or us in the room alone, against the creation of a natural, organic, systemic, that cannot be planned or centrally defined by one person or one small group of persons? Does the individual has agency, or are we in an age of fatalism?
It's very difficult to know how to answer that because, in a sense, yes, agency, but if you ask about the powers of different agents, meaning human individuals, and agencies, meaning institutions and systems, it's much harder for people to tell who, it goes back to Hugh's question, who said what? Where did it come from? Who put that inscription there? Who created this soundtrack I am listening to? Was it fake or was it not? And in history we have had, of course, notorious fakes of many sorts. And now we have got this populist term, fake news. I would say myself, if it's news, it ain't fake, and if it's fake, it ain't news. But still, I understand entirely what is meant by fake news, and I understand how tempting it is to certain individuals and institutions, on the one hand, to create misleading content and target it on certain others. On the other hand, how tempting it is to dismiss genuine but unliked content as fake. And we know who does that quite a lot.
Joanna.
A related follow-up on that. The Internet Governance Forum, it was strongly recommended that we don't use the word fake news because explicitly it was used by autocrats to dismiss the real news. And rather, we use the terms, the conventional terms, propaganda or disinformation.
No, that's right. And of course, the DCMS white paper, I think misinformation and disinformation will cover most of the purposes we have in mind. And it has been unfortunate that this term has received immense currency in the last year. I don't think we can probably get it out of the system now. I would like to, but as I say, if it's news, it ain't fake, and if it's fake, it ain't news. But it's an oxymoronic term that has acquired a certain currency, and how to squelch it is a big problem.
Okay, so if there are no more questions, let's wrap up. Onora said at one point, she told us about her experience buying a new kettle and said how useful it was to be able to go online and get fairly reliable reviews so that she was able to buy a 5-star kettle. But she suggested that was only for rather generic choices of that kind. My guess is she's being too pessimistic there. And if one of our machine learning friends wanted to sit down and write a little app which scraped the web for reputational comments, you could easily select your keynote speakers for my keynote. And I'm sure if we did that, then Onora would be a 5-star keynote speaker. It was actually human intelligence which went into the choice. But Onora, thank you so much for talking to us today and for participating.